Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Anna Rose. I'm the Exhibition and Programming Associate at the Wende, and thanks for tuning in today for Cold War Spaces. This is our 37th talk in the series, and this week's topic is Futurist Spaces, the struggle for the post-Cold War imagination. And we are joined by Jenny Andersson. She is an economic historian and CNRS research professor at the Center for European Studies. She is the project director of FuturePol, a project on the political history of the future, knowledge production, and future governance in the post-war period. She also co-directed the Franco-German Collaborative Research Center, Maxpo. And she's the author of the books Between Growth and Security, Swedish Social Democracy from a Strong Society to a Third Way from 2006, and the Library and the Workshop, Social Democracy and Capitalism in the Knowledge Age from 2009, and from 2018, The Future of the World, Futurology, Futurists, and the Struggle for the Post-Cold War Imagination. So today's program will be about a 30-minute conversation between Jenny and Segal, the Wende's chief curator and director of programming. After that, we'll leave about 15 minutes for Q&A, so please get your questions ready to put in the Q&A box during that time. As always, we appreciate everyone's questions, but please keep them short to no longer than a sentence or two. And for other comments or discussion, the chat box is open. So as we're getting started, feel free to say hi, and it's always nice to see what city you're tuning in from. We'll be posting the recording of this program on our Vimeo page afterwards, and also in podcast form on our SoundCloud page. And lastly, I'd like to thank Susan Horwitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And now I'll pass it off to you to get started with the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna Rose. And Jenny, welcome to Cold War Spaces. Great to have you in this series.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm glad to be here.
Fantastic. So let me start with the title of this program, because usually in this series, we use the word space with an adjective, but you immediately emphasize that it is important in this case to use the plural spaces. Can you explain why that is so central to your argument?
So any geographer would say that space is always a plural concept, and all historians will say that time also is a plural concept. And if we think about Cold War spaces, and particularly futurist spaces, they really are plural spaces, because the Cold War was many different wars and many different cultures. And in fact, also different geographies and different times entangled. Futurists had really very different spaces, and they were all informed and formated by the Cold War experience. But futurists that I call in the book futurologists, who came from the sort of military industrial establishment in the US, they had a very distinct Cold War geography, which was really linked to the American Cold War experience and to the West European experience. Whereas futurists who in many ways really object to the entire Cold War, and who have this sort of basic assumption that we should have peace and not war, and who think very much about how to counteract imperialist and warmongering forms of prediction, and who in many times came from completely different spaces, both in Eastern Europe, but also all over the world, in India, for instance, and in Malaysia. They had really different spaces. So they had different geographical spaces in terms of their belonging and where they came from. They also had different networks. So they were inscribed in different, what historians would call transnational spaces. And they also had different spaces just in terms of actually thinking the future as a space. So Cold War prediction is a lot about thinking the future as a closed space that can be predicted, that is essentially controllable. And many of the more imaginative futurists linked to the peace movement and decolonization and so on, they really thought the future as a totally different space that was made up essentially by the human imagination and by the capacity to imagine and love a totally different future. So I think this is both a geographic question and also a metaphorical one.
Great, yeah, and we will discuss several of these different imaginations of the future. Maybe let's start with Hannah Arendt, who in 1961 wrote her book Between Past and Future. And her outlook is pretty somber. She reflects on the role of technology in the modern world and actually sees a society that is overly rational and in a way that actually makes the future meaningless, because there are no moral values and no supporting moral ideas anymore. Can you tell us a little bit how she came to her assessment and whether the Second World War, the Holocaust, maybe the nuclear arms race informed her outlook?
Sure. I mean, I think this essay or this bunch of essays in the book is a really, really intriguing set of writings. And it's also interesting to me that, for instance, the moon landing, so Arendt writes a lot about the probe on the moon, so the first satellite that was sent to the moon before the moon landing, has retrospectively sort of been imagined as a great sense of progress. We all celebrate, well, not me, obviously, because I wasn't born, but my parents' generation celebrated the moon landing as a giant step for humanity. But Arendt doesn't see it that way. She sees it as a naive and very dangerous belief in the forces of technology. And so one of the words, and clearly that is informed by the Holocaust experience and also by the experience of being really literally ejected from Germany. And it also has a lot to do with her relationship with Heidegger, but that's a really long story. But Heidegger had this aggressive futurism, and Arendt's futurism is more of a civilizational one, that you have to belong and you have to have that belonging. And if you're ejected from somewhere, then you no longer belong. And so she understands the conquest of space as a kind of voluntary ejection into space. And she also understands it as a kind of example of a human rationality that has totally lost touch with moral values, with any sense of good or bad. So the loss of capacity to evaluate, are we making progress that is good for us as a human collective, or is bad for us? And she is also very concerned with what she calls cosmic powers. And cosmic powers refers to the space conquest, but it also refers a lot to the atom, so the conquering of the atom.
Mm-hmm.
And her idea there, and she's not alone in this, so we would find the same kind of arguments from Lewis Mumford, for instance, is that really man is like an animal who has found a new toy, and with technology we're able to tinker with things that we could not tinker with before. And now these powers are so strong that actually we have the capacity to undo ourselves and change the cosmos, the world around us, or the sort of time-space continuum. And so she sees this gap between technological rationality and human maturity. And so this is really a child. It's a child with a toy, because the child is not mature enough to understand the consequences of what it would mean to unmake the universe and unmake all of those limits that create a human sense of belonging.
Right. And you mentioned Mumford. So he actually stated that we are in need of utopian thinking, not in order to create a perfect society, but just to check on the technological dangers we are surrounded with. And did he actually directly respond to Hannah Arendt in this sense, or did he have his own background to come up with his ideas about utopia?
I'm not aware that there was much communication between Mumford and Arendt. For sure, there was communication between Hannah Arendt and Hans Jonas. So Hans Jonas is the father of what we call the precautionary principle, which is also a critical stance on technology, so that we should preemptively evaluate new technologies because we need to know that we can grasp their consequences. And if we cannot, then we should not venture down that technological path. But they really stand for, I think, a kind of civilizational critique, or a critique of progress and technology, which was shared by many different intellectuals. Mumford believes, of course, that we have to rehumanize technology, and that there are many ways of rehumanizing technology, but that some technologies become total. And so, for instance, he argued that the atomic bomb was a total technology. It was so large, and it involved so much systemic effort in everything from science to government investment and infrastructure, and world politics, that it would have a civilizational mark. And so he has this argument that if we build the total machine, then we have lost the human capacity to control it. So I think that's very much part of the same kind of ideas in the 50s.
Right. But then to switch to someone with very different ideas, actually 1 year before Hannah Arendt published Between Past and Future, Daniel Bell came with The End of Ideology, which is plaidoyer for a society directed by science, rationality, and he and also other people who were associated with the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was a network of anti-totalitarian intellectuals, were very much associated with the idea of the modernization theory. So the liberal idea of the future. Actually, you write about it and saying the modernization theory positioned American civilization and the liberal capitalist society as the image of the future. And that sounds like a very closed concept of the future. Were there any discussions within the people associated with the Congress for Cultural Freedom about whether their concept or whether this modernization theory was actually more or less a totalitarian concept in the sense of a closed future?
I don't think that they would have discussed it as a totalitarian concept, because for them, actually all the way up until the mid-1960s, this is still a really hopeful thesis. So the modernization thesis is not to them totalitarian. It's like an evangel for humanity. The whole world will have these steps of modernization, and people will embrace capitalism and market commodities, and that means that the great totality of the global population will become middle class and end with suffering and so on. So it's really a quintessentially optimistic thesis, but it has kind of gloomy aspects to it, because there is also in the modernization thesis a certain fear of the mass. So there is which was a leftover from 1930s thinking in global social science, but there is this fear that you will never really know what a mass politics will be like. And in the 1950s, so after the Second World War, so of course the interwar thesis was that the mass had no sense of orientation and direction, and so it could be seduced by someone like Hitler. And one of the things actually that lead people like Bell to think about futurology after the war is that they want to predict what could possibly happen with the energy in politics. So what could possibly make a new mass, because after 1945 it's almost a more dangerous mass, because it's kind of it's much richer than before. People are not unemployed and starving. People have certain forms of information technology. People are more educated, so they become really concerned with what might happen to this mass, and how would you be able to foresee if a country, for instance, would fall into communism, which is the great fear. So I don't think it's a totalitarian thesis as such. What is really interesting with the modernization thesis and with futurology, so I think really this is how Daniel Bell thinks about it, is that they're not sure that the mass will make the good choice. So after 1945, there is universal suffrage since the interwar period. The mass has a vote, and the mass is in the process of changing Western democratic systems. And so they're extremely concerned with what the mass will turn out to be. Will it be a rational voter that votes for this continuous liberal capitalist enlightened future, or will it do something else with that vote? So they're very concerned about the different orientations in which democracy might develop, and they're quite concerned with sort of finding various forms of possible corrections to mass democracy.
Right. So yeah, totalitarian was of course a little bit provocative, but there seems to be some paradox involved in the fact that on the one hand, it's about the end of ideology, so the future is open, but then the society that carries that open future is very well defined, which seems there seems to be a tension there. Yeah.
I think that was a tension, definitely. And also Modernization Thesis was on all accounts a failure, and they are, I think they're actually quite aware of the tensions and frictions in the Modernization Thesis all along, and it doesn't begin with the great, so it's usually credited with coming into crisis due to the unrest in the American cities, but of course it began with decolonization, which did not go in the direction that an American sort of liberal Cold War intelligentsia had desired.
Right. So in the 1960s, you also write about the Rent Corporation and how they, at that time, tried to integrate computer rationality in the social sciences and using gaming theory and things like that. Would you say that at that point, the Rent Corporation actually opted for a kind of society controlled by experts? So of course they were very much in support of democracy, but yeah, more or less the same problem we discussed earlier with the masses. They also seem to very much stress the importance of control by specialists.
Absolutely, and I think, this is also a sort of benevolent thesis, which is a great interest in forms of prediction as what they call a social technology. So if we can, for instance, predict how certain values might develop, then we might be able to say to people, maybe that's not a good development, maybe you should think differently. This is kind of the logic that they have. And so we know at RAND, for instance, also that there was a very important transfer from thinking about the prediction of war to thinking about really the prediction of civilian affairs and domestic policy issues, and actually preeminently really the race question. So they're very concerned with what will happen to the mass. In this case is the American Black population, what will happen to the population in the American ghettos. So they're thinking about forms of correction and control. And I think that can be described as a certain idea of expertise. And in a sense, it's part of the function of expertise that expertise is an aid to a democratic process. We all need expertise, at least that's my way of thinking about it. But at RAND, there was also something a little bit more sinister going on, which was that they also thought that perhaps a recourse to certain forms of prediction or social technologies would be able to sort of take the passion out of politics and replace the conflict in politics and all of these passionate feelings of people that had not been included, in fact, in American society and on equal terms before, and replace their judgment with a kind of expert judgment. And I think that holds a more sinister tone.
Right. You also write about the Soviet Union and the East European countries. Very interesting to see how social science there was also inspired by future studies, or future studies made up an important part of social studies, especially I understood between 1953, the death of Stalin, and 1968. Yeah. And there were also lots of exchanges with Western Europe and maybe the United States. So can you tell us a little bit about what characterized Soviet bloc future studies? Was it in tune with Marxism-Leninism, or was it more autonomous? And why was 1968 an end date for this kind of studies?
So I personally think actually this is one of the most interesting parts of the book, and I wish that I was more competent in the history of Eastern Europe and the languages of Eastern Europe. So I always want to say that I'm so grateful that I was able to work with extremely excellent young East European historians in the writing of this chapter who helped me a lot. So what happens between 1953 and 1968 is basically that after Stalin dies, there is a period of an opening up of the social science space. So the social sciences were extremely controlled and even purged. during the time of Stalin. And in some countries after 1953, so most notably Poland and Hungary, there is a real rehabilitation of forms of social science. And so they have this little escape from Marxism-Leninism, and they begin thinking the future differently from these ideas of law-bound developments that are in Marxism-Leninism. And so one of the things that they think about is, what if the future is not systemically determined, but open in the sense that it's made up of people's visions and images and people's sentiments and feelings and longings for something different. And these guys were not at all, they were not all radical dissidents. In fact, it was really kind of a slippery slope. And so they had different dissident positions also due to the fact that the regimes in Eastern Europe were different. But that was not necessarily an anti-communist stance. They were definitely futurist dissidents in Eastern Europe who were Marxists and who actually thought that this was the original standpoint of Marx, that Marx himself had a more humane and humanist idea of the future than Marxism-Leninism had given him credit for. So they actually reinvent some of the things in Marx. Yeah, and then what happens in 1968 is that this period of relaxation comes to an end, because that is when futurists dare criticize Soviet planning. And that's a very notable incident with a Czech futurist called Radovan Richta, who becomes very involved in this Prague Spring. And Czech futurists actually create what they call futurological societies, which are a kind of debate club that talk about what might be there after the Soviet system. And this is just too much.
I see, yeah. Can you give us one example of one of these academics, these scholars or intellectuals like Mihai Botes in Romania, how they evolved into a dissident position?
So Botes, I think, is a very interesting case. He's also a very famous dissident case. And he began as a mathematician and ran projections of the Romanian economy. He's a Romanian mathematician. And he rapidly, and Romania at this point in time under Ceausescu is undergoing a very fierce process of industrialization. And Botes is one of the Romanian intellectuals who observes that the Romanian countryside is changing, that the Romanian peasant, which was this icon of Ceausescu, is actually dying because the villages are dying. And he becomes very concerned with this. And then all of this in Ceausescu's system is too dangerous to say. So Botes really uses mathematics and what is called systems analysis. So modeling, very complex technical modeling of the Soviet system, of the communist system, in order to really project the conclusion that this system can never hold up. This model is not total, the system is not closed, there are constant forms of openings. And he eventually ends up in the US. He has to leave Romania.
I see, okay. I want to read a quotation from your book in 1968, while speaking about power relations. The West German journalist Robert Jung and the Norwegian sociologist Johan Galtung, who were both international peace activists, they wrote, "Only the developed nations are defined as autonomous in the sense of having their own future. This means that it is in the power of the rich nations to define and refine the future." So that is a strong sentence. And how would you evaluate it more than 50 years later, in this time?
You know, there's an anthropologist that I really like called Arjan Appadurai, and he says, the capacity to imagine the future is very unevenly distributed. Because of course, well, we've all been shaken up by the COVID situation, by the pandemic, but of course, people whose material needs are fulfilled think about the future extremely differently from someone who is completely destitute, and people in the West think about the future extremely differently from people in the global south, and then there is a huge difference between aspiring middle class and those layers of population that cannot perhaps even aspire to something. So I think this is a very valid point. And I think this is the case. I think that it would, I wish that some scholar would write a sort of global sociology of future visions. I think that would be extremely interesting. And of course, it is also true that even in the West, people today have a real difficulty imagining the future. And I think that's another really crucial point. I actually wanted to say also that I think that the capacity to imagine the future is very different between generations. And I don't think that young people today have at all the same idea of the future that I did when I was growing up. So I see very committed, activist young people, but the future to them is almost meaningless because they're afraid that there won't even be a future. So that is a very different understanding. I mean, my generation grew up in constant projections of forward and development, and we'll educate ourselves and we'll buy something new. We were constantly thinking forwards.
Yeah, well, you actually mentioned in your book that there is this transition from a period of activism, utopianism, etc., to a period, and maybe the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of state socialism had something to do with it. The rise of people like Francis Fukuyama with their idea of the end of history, that it's no use anymore to create utopian alternatives because we are there. We have reached the end point of social history. How would you see the transition from that kind of thinking to what you just described, a new generation that is activist, but without a clear sense of the future? And how can we maybe also get back to this utopian element, which is stressed all over in your book by so many people? We need these images, we need these inspiring ideas to make sense of our life on Earth.
I mean, I think that even Fukuyama recognizes since a while back that he was wrong and the world took a very different turn from what he had imagined. I really think that we need utopias, but I also think that the utopias have to change, and the utopian energy and what utopia is has to change. And so one of the things that very often annoys me a little bit is when people say, the future is open. You cannot know anything about the future. The future is there to be grabbed or taken, or that democracy is about open futures. This I find is a great. It's just a total illusion of our time, because for a lot of people the future is not open, and even for scholars, we have to believe, in my view, in knowledge. We have to believe in climate change, and then we have to accept that there are certainly things that we know about the future, and those things are inherently problematic. So our future space, so the kind of space of maneuver that we have today, is smaller than it was for the people that I describe in my book in the 60s and 70s, because they had not had this period that historians of environment call the Great Acceleration, where fossil fuels really take off, which is the period from the 1970s onwards. So we've lost lots of maneuvering space. So I want to say that we definitely need utopias, but I think that we need, and this is really difficult, I think we need a kind of new marriage between humanities and social sciences, and also people like you guys, museum people or artists, journalists, theater actors, very normal people too, in joining what we know, questions about what this will mean, how it makes us feel, and how we would like to feel different. I would love to see just this new way of doing humanities and social science in relation to what we have good reason to think will be a really catastrophic future. That, in a sense, would be a utopia to me.
Right, that sounds very inspiring. It is 12:30, so time to move to the Q&A. Please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box and I will read them aloud. Since there is no question yet, let me ask you something on a slightly lighter tone. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about how future researchers during the Cold War might or might not have been influenced by science fiction writing?
They were influenced by science fiction writing, and they also thought that science fiction was a very legitimate way of dealing with the future, in the meaning, in the sense that you could only imagine the future from the outskirts of the human imagination and from the scientific or technological imaginary. So many of them were also science fiction writers. So Arthur C. Lewis, for instance, is a famous American instance of that, or in the East European context, Stanislav Lam. Lam, I find, is a really, really interesting character who wrote his book, The Futurological Congress, which is not a really nice depiction of futurologists, because he really sees them as kind of evil spin doctors of the Cold War. But they were certainly very interested in science fiction, but they were also interested in other things that were sort of on the border of the scientific imagination. So for instance, several futurists did future exhibitions. So imagining a kind of number of artifacts or collections that you could then exhibit so that people could see this is what the future might be like, or museums of future peace, where people of the Cold War could see what a war of peace would be, in the idea that they would then like that and sort of try to project themselves into that state.
Right. Can you give an example of one of those exhibitions and how they were received or how they functioned?
So we had a hard time with this because it was hard to find the materials, but for sure there was exhibitions like that in Vienna, around Robert Junk's Futures Library. There was also exhibitions, I know, in Berlin, and they were really linked to the peace movement. And then in the US, there was a political scientist called Harold Laswell who worked a lot with futurism. He was one of the few really serious academics who was into futurism. And he thought a lot about the future of the international system and how to create an enduring peace, which was actually one of the key problems that came out of the Cold War era. And he worked also with this construction of future exhibits.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Giles Scott Smith, who, as you know, is one of the eminent specialists in the field of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And he writes, the 60th anniversary of Gagarin's spaceflight has illustrated how important space travel was for Soviet ideas of progress and the future. Do you see a difference in this sense between US and Soviet Russian attitudes towards space in the future, or are they the same in relation to the possibilities of technology?
I think that they were actually remarkably similar, and both Soviet and American visions of time and space were what I would now call deeply imperialistic and deeply informed by a colonization logic, where you put science and technology to the use of inventing future space for the purposes of the present. And it was one of the things that was really fascinating with the project that we had, was that there was also so much transnational exchange going on during really the height of the Cold War era between Soviet and American forecasters, because they really read each other. And it was actually also one of the areas that was legitimate for transnational exchanges, because both regimes, the American and the Soviet one, thought that this was of vital interest. So there's a lot of exchange going on there.
Right. Thank you. Next question is by Jason Lantz. I wonder how the punk slogan of no future might serve to inform our own fear of an absent future. Might punk, its amateurism and do-it-yourself ethos, serve as a model for rethinking utopia?
It's a tricky question for me. I mean, maybe. I don't know. I think I would prefer no future to open future. I'm very skeptical of this idea of the open future. Sure, but it's also somehow nihilistic, and I guess nihilism was always an element of punk. I like a kind of in-between model, which is to say there are limits to our future, and just as there are limits to everything that we do. And I actually think that there is something to be said for Hannah Arendt's point that if we lose the limits in the future, then we become ungrounded. And so having limits, having borders to our universe, whether they are in time or in space, that's a way of becoming grounded again. No future seems to me perhaps a little bit too dark.
Yeah. Well, speaking about borders, Louis Mumford mentioned that he thought that in order to create functioning and livable worlds, we need some oversight, oversight of world government, a world federation, something like that. But looking around at the globe right now, you see growing right-wing populist thoughts, nationalism, xenophobia, etc. Are we drifting away from the promise that we can actually create a livable future?
Yeah, I think that we are. I think that we are, and I think also that we have very unfairly dumped the problem on our children and their children. You know, world government was a very utopian idea, but there were many people after 1945, like Mumford, who thought that there were truly global problems. So problems to do with a future common to all world populations that only could be dealt with on a truly global level. So that was the idea of world government. And they were extremely hopeful about the UN system in the 50s, and then they become increasingly disenchanted. And I think that the entire idea of ruling the world today would be sort of really, really hopeless. And also, I'm not sure that I would like for present day politicians always to have the power to rule the world. So I don't really believe in the idea of world government, but I believe that it would be truly important to invest the idea of world governance with some kind of utopian energy, and that it has to be about this idea of sharing the capacity to think about the future and reinvent it as a place where we actually want to be. And it's very often said in for instance, processes concerning climate change and so on, that we have to swap one population's or one generation's consumption space for someone else's, and that there are constant trade-offs. But we could also imagine that there are fundamental things that bring us together as human beings. And I don't necessarily want to consume more in Sweden if it means that people in India or in Bangladesh lose their fertile soil and their capacity to subsist. So, you know, I think that we have also seen really extremely technocratic processes of world governance in the last 20 or 30 years. And so we almost have no popular legitimacy for those processes anymore. So I think that the idea of world government is maybe not a real utopia, but it's some kind of vision of how things might at least change.
So at what level would you say would at least a conversation, a global conversation take place? Would the United Nations be the right institution, or should we think completely differently about it?
You know, I think that we need at this point to work on all levels with all people, and that of course is monumentally difficult. I was a few years back in something called the International Panel on Social Progress, which was an attempt to bring together academics around the problem of social progress. And it was interesting that almost all academics on that global panel were in quite a large agreement that what the world needs is less market and more regulation and more planning, but also deeper forms of democracy and less elitism. And so it seems to me that those are a number of points that are in fact not so antagonistic, but quite unanimously shared. And I think that many people could find a grounds in that. And I think what Mumford meant with world government was finding a few principles that people could believe in. For instance, an end to the Cold War and a right to development and an end to famine. And we certainly have those huge global challenges to deal with.
Right. Thank you. And we have a few more questions. First one by Sharon Asmodeh. Are there any clear intellectual trends between futurists' views of the world and the economics of the period in which they published their writings and thoughts?
How will I answer that? Well, I do think that futurism or futurology came into a period of crisis with the end of the what we call the golden era, so the end of the post-war period of boom and employment and mass consumption, which happened with the stagflation crisis, so the onset of inflation and depression in the mid-1970s. So they were more concerned, in a sense, with the problems that economic growth brought than they were with a possible absence of economic growth. Yes, I think that's absolutely true, yes.
Right. Next question is by Matthew Longerhausen. Are there any continuities between post-World War II utopias and the older 19th century utopias or futurist practices?
Yeah, this is a great question that I am really keen to think about. Yes, I think there were, because I think that fundamentally the utopian instinct is quite similar over time. There is really something that comes back. So for instance, the idea of using the radical imagination and trying to find ways of transcending the present and really finding ways of sort of really imagining what is not imaginable to the present. But what I thought was a really interesting thing was that some of the futurists, partly Mumford, for instance, but also Hans Jonas, and to some extent, I think Arendt, but Arendt was not really a futurist, but they actually reject the idea of utopia because they also think at some point in the Cold War era that hope is an ephemeral and rather hopeless thing. And what they believe in instead is a new sense of responsibility. I think this has to do with this idea of limits. So Hans Jonas, for instance, thinks that what we have to do is educate this really immature human being so that the human being can take responsibility for these horrible technologies that the human subject is unleashing. And that is the utopia. So that there is the utopia in recognizing that we are the only animal in the world that can actually change the future, and therefore we have a fundamental responsibility for it, Jonas says. So I think that's a completely new dimension, in fact, to utopian thinking, that the futurists are bringing this really strong sense and stress on responsibility, and that's really a post-1945 thing.
Right, thank you. Then we have a question by Christy Davis. How do you see Paul Virilio's concept of square zero fit within the futurist theories? And is it still applicable to futurology today?
Can someone remind me of what he means with square zero? Because I have read him, but I'm not, I can't identify this right now.
Christy Davis, can you follow up with a short explanation? And then in the meantime, let me ask you one other question. You spoke about the importance of planning, but isn't it a problem that it might be very hard to find the right kind of society where planning actually works? Because if you have an authoritarian society, planning is very one-sided and not necessarily in support of what people need. If you have a democratic society, planning only lasts until the next election. So how does that function?
Also, some great philosopher has to figure out this problem, right? And it's not going to be me, but I think one of the ways to think about it is that there is definitely a problem with the future and the electoral periods of modern democracy, contemporary democracy. So we need to do something about the future that takes it out of the electoral cycle. I think that's pretty important. And I'm also quite concerned with the fact that present day politics are so tormented, and not just in the US, but in Europe as well, that it seems really hard to arrive at majorities, even for really huge future questions, which somehow to me is just an indication of political complete irrationality. If we can't save ourselves then surely we have no democratic legitimacy, or our decision processes are not legitimate if they cannot fulfill that ultimate objective. So that's one thing. And then I think, planning comes in very, very different forms. We could also there are countries that experiment with very decentralized and localized notions of planning. There are some people in the future field who think very seriously about constitutional change, that we may have to inscribe the rights of future generations into constitutions. And I personally think that would make sense, because we need to see them as rights-bearing entities.
Right. Thank you very much. So Christy Davis explained the square zero theory. It's the theory of acceleration.
Okay.
That technology gets to the point of advancement and that it then collapses and society goes back to square zero.
Right. Yeah. I think that could happen. I don't think it's very likely to happen, but I'm not sure, because I think that there have been moments where we've come quite close to civilizational collapse, only maybe we don't realize it. And then on the other hand, the opposite is true. So I mean, the pandemic, which I think has been really close to societal collapse in several instances, has also meant that all of us are now doing completely high-tech lives, where we're Zooming with California at 9:30 in the evening in Europe. So I don't know, I think it's true, but I don't think that there are many historical instances of that kind of event where technology goes to zero. I think it's more a story of alternative technological solutions being either more cost efficient, and cost efficient could also be that they're more environmentally friendly, because it has to do, of course, with how we cost it, and they then replace an existing technological system. And as a general rule, I'm not a great believer in the great revolution and then the fix. I don't think that social change works that way.
Jenny, I want to thank you very much for a very inspiring conversation. This was
Thank you. Thank you, everyone who has listened in.
Right. So next week, we continue with our other series, Art Past Present. And my guests will be Nihai Feng, Chinese artist who divides his time between Amsterdam and Beijing and reflects in his artwork on the history and presence of globalization. And my co-host next week will be artist, writer, and curator Katja Tilewicz. And then in 2 weeks from now, resume Cold War Spaces. And my guest will be Andreas Bernhard, professor of at the Center for Digital Cultures at the Leuphana University in Lüneburg, Germany. And we will speak about pandemic space, medical knowledge, and data organization. So I hope to see you at one of these other programs and wish you a wonderful week.